Psychology as a discipline has historically served the interests of dominant groups in society. By contrast, contemporary trends in psychological work have emerged as a direct result of the impact of violent histories of slavery, genocide, and colonization. Hence, we propose that psychology, particularly in its social forms, as a discipline centered on the relationship between mind and society, is well placed to produce the critical knowledge and tools for imagining and promoting just and equitable social relationships and social structures. Starting with an overview of the historical assumptions of the disciplines that served to legitimate systems of slavery, colonization, and apartheid, this article then introduces a framework for centering decolonial, feminist ways of doing psychological work with a focus on the particularities of the African context. We argue that a decolonial feminist approach to psychology curricula and psychological research is necessary for the discipline to remain relevant in contemporary African contexts. Keywords: decolonial psychology, feminist psychology, critical psychology, relevance. Introduction. Psychology as a discipline has historically served the interests of dominant groups in society. The discipline has been critiqued for being complicit during colonization and apartheid and for contribution uttering to and reinforcing its ideologies of white supremacy, Nicholas and Cooper, 1990. Psychologists drew historically from philosophies that espoused the hierarchical categorization of people into race groups, defending evolutionary ideas of natural selection and survival of the fittest, closely linked to the study of phrenology and eugenics, Magubane, 2007. Examples include the early 20th century psychological projects that involved intelligence and other forms of psychometric testing, Foster, 1991, also referred to as race science, Howitt and Owusu-Bempah, 1994, Richards, 1997, which have had a pervasive impact on how African people have been represented and treated. Department of Psychology, University of Cape Town, South Africa. Corresponding author. Shoes.Kessie. Article. Across the Globe. Arthur Jensen's and H.J. Iseng's widely read body of work on race and IQ is less than 50 years old and argues that intelligence is determined by genes, including racial heritage. These types of psychological studies serve to legitimize the institutionalization of racialized, classist, and gender population control policies, education programs, and general racializing beliefs about African people in the United States and globally, El Saadawi, 1997, Mama, 1995, Shervington, 1994. As recently as 2006, similar thinking has been used by evolutionary psychologists to argue that there is a correlation between low IQ and low levels of health in sub-Saharan Africa, Kanazawa, 2006, allowing dominant nations to re-legitimize their dominance in relation to post-colonial contexts. Neuropsychology as a subdiscipline also perpetuates problematic assumptions about differences between brain types that can lead to oppressive practices when these ideas come into the public domain and reinforce common sense and often stereotypical understandings of Black, poor, women, and lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender, LGBT people, C. O'Connor, Reeves, and Jock, 2012. These projects and their reliance on scientific inquiry are also a reflection of psychology's desire to be regarded as a hard science reliant on perceived methodological rigor and objectivity in contrast to the presumed softness of the humanities and social sciences. Psychological null-edge production also primarily takes place in university contexts, which are themselves intricate agents and repositories of neoliberal practice and ideology, Lewis, 2016, page 5. In these contexts, we see an increasing erosion of support for the humanities and its exploration of human subjective ITY, while there is increasing provision and funding for the hard sciences, Lewis, 2016. The implication of this is that there is increased support for particular kinds of psychological knowledge. Edge production that works to further entrench objective ways of knowing and understanding. Human behavior and subjectivity. In addition to the discipline's complicity in the production and reproduction of racializing knowledge, psychology has also maintained an androcentric focus and worked to maintain a hetero-patriarchal status quo. The white, heterosexual, middle-class, able-bodied, cisgendered male experience is the position from which generalizations and theorizations have been produced and cast as normative, McLeod, 2004. While what has been considered to be women's issues have been marginalized in the production of knowledge in psychology, there has been a simultaneous silencing of experiences that challenge the normative, for example, research on gendered and sexual diversity. The role of the discipline in regulating behavior and constructing what is considered normal and what is not cannot be overstated. This is evident in the ways in which the experiences of poor women, Black women and lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer or questioning, and intersex, LGBTQI, populations have not only been written out but also deeply pathologized, Phoenix, 1987, Sheffer, Bunzayer, and Kigawa, 2006. Psychology, in addition, including psychologies practiced in most of the post-colonial world, has maintained a Euro-American approach, privileging knowledges and approaches produced in the North and relying on post-colonial contexts for the mining of data and producing the idea that relevant theorizing is only possible in Euro-American contexts. Connell, 2014, Mama, 1995. Much psychology in Africa suffers from what Beninese philosopher Paulin Hountondji, 1997, calls the problem of extroversion. Knowledge producers in post-colonial contexts have to cite Euro-American scholars and publish in Euro-American journals in order to gain recognition in their fields. Connell, 2014. These practices are not unique to psychology, however, but are indica of the role of the university in Africa as a vehicle for cultural westernization. Mazrui, 2005. Locating our knowledge base in Euro-American perspectives can have the effect of reproducing knowledge about colonial peoples in stigmatizing and dehumanizing ways, as backward, passive, and lacking in capabilities. Dogra, 2012. This epistemic violence, Spivak, 1988, leads to detrimental outcomes, such as widespread beliefs in the inferiority of colonial people who may also. Kessie and Bunzeyer, 301. Internalize such ideas about themselves and others. Fico, 1978. Fannin, 1986. By contrast, alternative or resistant forms of psychology emerging from post-colonial contexts, such as liberation psychology in Latin America, e.g., Jimenez Dominguez, 2009, Montero and Son, 2009, Black consciousness movements in South Africa, Mangani, 1973, or indigenous psychologies from the Australasian region, e.g., Groot, Rua, Masters Awatir, Dungeon and Garvey, 2012, take the psychology of the oppressed as the starting point for scientific inquiry combined with the social justice agenda. Nevertheless, these theories have not significantly entered the mainstream of teaching and research in psychology on our continent. Current global debates on decolonization have resurrected and propelled further efforts to think about the ways in which the production of psychological knowledge works to entrench colonial ways of representing and working with the other. Decolonization therefore deeply implicates the psychological. What are considered normal and legitimate ways of being, doing and seeing are fundamentally implicated in our minds and systems of values and beliefs. Psychology as a field originally located as a science of the mind and human behavior needs to confront its historicity and expand its potential to become a discipline that is socially and politically relevant. Psychology, through its curriculum and research practices, regulates the boundaries of entry. Carolison, Sheffer, and Smith, 2015, page 16, into the discipline and regulates the reproduction of power relations in society. Psychology in Africa should therefore prioritize curricula and research agendas that draw on alternative philosophical principles emerging from African cultures, Beloyi, 2008, and experiences, but also those that challenge a social and ahistorical thinking, Carolison et al., 2015, in favor of a socially just agenda. Can psychology advance a social justice agenda? Interesting developments in early and mid-20th century Euro-American social psychology were concerned with racial injustices. While American social psychologists were concerned with issues of racial attitudes in the context of desegregation policies following the abolishment of slavery, social psychologists in Europe were seeking to understand the causes of anti-Semitism in the aftermath of the Holocaust. Alport, 1954, The Nature of Prejudice represents important work that led to the development of a range of studies exploring racial attitudes. Another landmark study, The Authoritarian Personality, Adorno, Frankel-Brunswick, Levinson, and Sanford, 1950, explores the role of personality in the study of prejudice and racism. Both attitudes and personality studies of prejudice to this day rely largely on experimental methods for measuring and changing implicit bias, such as implicit association tasks and contact theory, Alport, 1954, the latter gaining track. Tie-in in South Africa following the dismantling of apartheid, Dixon, Durkheim, and Trudeau, 2007. Other developments concentrating on the role of identity have sought to explain prejudice and discrimination as a group-based cognitive process, Tadgeful and Turner, 1986. Championing the idea that identity is mediated by the group or social context, social identity theorists opened up an important conversation on identity as a driving factor in political processes and social change, Klandermans, 2014, Riker, 2004. Despite the value of these developments for the study of racism and other forms of discrimination in the field of psychology, critical perspectives have raised concerns with the reliance on cognitive understandings of prejudice. Focusing on cognitive bias locates the problem of prejudice within the mind of the individual, Henriquez, 1984, without allowing for an interrogation of the systemic and institutional nature of social oppressions. The turn to social constructionism in social psychology, Gergen, 2009, highlights the discursive and everyday actions through which prejudice, Dyson discrimination is reproduced, often in subtle ways. Studies of racist discourse, Potter and Wetherell, 1987, Van Dyke, 1992, Wetherell and Potter, 1992, and and on the social representations of. 302 South African Journal of Psychology 48, 3. Race, Howard, 2004, Philogene, 1999, are examples of social constructionist orientations that take into account the socio-political and historical environment and that treat race as relational and inextricably tied to power relations. Phoenix, 1998. Historically, psychology has also been complicit in the production and reproduction of the idea of two sexes, with these being constructed as fundamentally different. Work on sex differences between women and men has consumed, particularly, North American psychologists Halpern, 1992, Maccabee and Jacklin, 1974. These efforts suggest that there may be psychological differences such as in women and men's visual/spatial abilities, verbal skills, and mathematical reason ing. This line of research has occupied many psychologists from the time Maccabee and Jacklin first published their work in 1974. Furthermore, the concept of gender identity is a psychological one, Burr, 1998. Psychological theories of childhood development have argued that the child, through different stages of development and in interaction with others, develops an emerging sense of themselves as gendered, and that they will, by a specific age, develop a core gender identity. This process has been described through the deployment of different theories, such as social learning, cognitive developmental, or psychoanalytic theories. These approaches move away from biological, essentialist understandings of the development of a gender identity through the recognition that interactions with others, such as parents and peers, and societal definitions of femininity and masculinity might shape one's developing sense of oneself as gendered. On the other hand, these theories have been critiqued for offering a deterministic view of gender identity development in the sense that biological differences are taken as the starting point for the development of gender differences. Social constructionist and feminist post-structuralist thinking within psychology provided important challenges to essentialism, particularly around areas of gender development. Burr, 1998. Gaby, 1989, Hallway, 1984, Whedon, 1987. These critiques provide recognition that meanings about gender are not inherent, but are socially agreed upon, and that womanhood and femininity are socially constructed categories that exist in relation to manhood and masculinity. The idea of difference as neutral is challenged too, through recognition that these meanings are socially contingent and imbued with power emerging from social, cultural, and historical processes and institutions to the extent that characteristics associated with masculinity become the norm and are imbued with more power than those deemed feminine. Challenges to the construct of a gender identity also occurred outside the boundaries of psychology, notably through the influential work of feminist philosopher Judith Butler. Butler, 1990, provided a number of challenges, first arguing that the categories of sex and gender cannot be distinguished from each other, and that both categories are social in the sense that they have both been constructed. This argument is borne out by the work of feminist biologist and Fausta Sterling, 2012, who makes the case that our decisions about sex classification into just two categories, female and male, is arbitrary. She argues that if genital surgery had not become normative, and that if we paid closer attention to the wide range of diversity and the number of cases of infants being born with ambiguous genitalia, then we would find it increasingly difficult to categorize individuals into just one of two sexes. The case of transgendered individuals also disrupts the assumed link between biological sex and gender. Although the discipline of psychology has found a way to pathologize this identification, through the invention of gender identity disorder as a psychological disorder defining those individuals who have a desire to assume a gender identity other than that which is associated with their biological sex, Smith, 2006. The reinclusion of gender identity disorder, albeit in revised form, in the most recent version of the DSM, provides an example of the continued ways in which psychology regulates and disciplines gendered behavior and pathologizes that which is not deemed normative. The association of trans-identification with mental illness has serious implications for the lives and subjectivities of trans-diverse individuals in relation to continued stigmatization and discrimination. Yost and Smith, 2014. Kessie and Bunzayer, 303. Critical, social constructionist and other approaches have given recognition to the fact that gendered identities and subjectivities are produced in social interactions as well as having disrupted the taken-for-granted links between sex, gender, and sexuality. Gendered subjectivities specifically are characterized as unconscious and conscious understandings of the self and one's world, which also involves understanding our relation to the world. Whedon, 1987. It is a process, not an identity, of experiencing and making sense of the world around us. Gendered subjectivity therefore refers specifically to living out one's gender identity. The notion of subjectivity rejects essentialism, fixedness, and consistency, positing instead a refashioned conception that acknowledges change, multiplicity, and contradiction. This idea of contradiction is an important advance in the conception of self, as the ability to tolerate contradiction allows us to understand behaviors and desires that might be inconsistent with our perceptions of who we think we are. Davey, 1989. To understand the power of identity in maintaining continuing individual and social differences and associated repressive practices, particularly those related to gender, we need to understand and theorize identity within a broader understanding of subjectivity that accounts for the range of non-rational, non-unitary, emotional, and unconscious dimensions of identity. Whedon, 2004. The potential for social and political change lies in the possibility of problematizing and challenging hegemonic forms of subjectivity. Despite the advances made in theorizing gender and other forms of subjectivity, a cursory reading of any mainstream psychological journal will evidence the ways in which the discipline of psychology continues to discipline and reproduce essentializing and stigmatizing tropes, especially of those who are already marginalized. Psychology in South Africa. In South Africa, debates about the relevance of psychology emerged in the 1980s. Progressive psychologists drew attention to the discipline's racist past and to its complicity in maintaining the status quo. The question of relevance emerged from the work of psychologists interested in a more socially oriented discipline, focusing on issues of liberation and social justice. Sutla, Stevens, and Sedat, 2001, given people's experiences of protracted colonialism, patriarchy, apartheid, and oppression. Such a stance involves a fundamental re-imaging of modern society through a critique of hyper-capitalist and heteropatriarchal globalization that reproduces poverty, inequality, and discrimination. These ideas constitute important contributions to the discipline and to knowledge projects that go beyond the ecology of the individual and that demand an engagement with global North-South relations of power in economic, political, and cultural terms, and their impact on the day-to-day realities of individuals, groups, families, and communities located in post-colonial society. Eddies and the diaspora. Ideas of liberation have taken root in Latin American approaches to Psychol Ogay, Montero, and Son, 2009, focusing on consciousness, Frary, 1974, and community empowerment in a global sphere. These have guided much community-oriented work in South Africa, Campbell, 2004. More recently, South African psychologists have concerned themselves with the link between post-colonialism and psychology, Hook, 2012, Kessie and Bunzeyer, 2017, McLeod, Badia, and Kessie, 2017, as another starting point for reflecting on the politics of location, representation, and practice in psychological work. These questions, coupled with an emerging decolonial stance in academic spaces in South Africa, have compelled us to reflect on a way forward for the study of psychology in our local and regional environment. A decolonial, feminist agenda for psychology in Africa. These developments in psychology are encouraging and indicative of the need to think through the kinds of institutional spaces that could grow and cultivate a decolonial, feminist project for 304 South African Journal of Psychology 48, 3. Psychology. We write here as two feminist, critical, decolonial psychologists invested and interested in creating an intellectual space that embraces a decolonial aesthetic and praxis for psychological work in South Africa, Africa, and the diaspora. In our current practice, we have long been involved in work that explores and disrupts political processes of psychological inferiorization and control. This work covers issues of gender-based violence and racialized violence, Bunzeyer, 2008, 2017, Kessie and Cornell, 2015, the stigmatization and oppression of poor and working-class communities, Kessie, 2011, 2013, and methodologies that promote the participation and collective action of marginalized groups, Bunzeyer, Lantinen, and Patman, 2015, Bunzeyer and Guys, 2018, Kessie, 2015. In doing this work, we have come to envision a transdisciplinary space for research and activism, including conversations, dialogues, exhibitions, and performances that caters for pluriversal knowledge. Edges about human life and ways of understanding and being in the world. To that end, we have established the Hub for Decolonial Feminist Psychologies in Africa, a Teach ING and research space located in the Department of Psychology at the University of Cape Town that advocates a transdisciplinary approach and that works with and against the historical and contemporary silences, erasures, and omissions in psychological theorizing and research. This Hub for Decolonial Feminist Psychologies represents an opportunity for necessary theoretical and methodological expansions in our field. The establishment of this space also represents a starting point for institutionalizing these developments in real and practical ways. We are sourcing funding for postgraduate students, initiating joint supervision and publication practices, assisting student-led transdisciplinary and participatory work. These activities seek to respond to the particular challenges of transformation in South African psychology departments. C. Carolison et al., 2015. Preparing STU. Dense, in particular Black students, for careers in psychology necessitates access in terms of funding sources, but also access to relevant teaching and learning practices and opportunities to get involved in research projects that speak to their experiences and prepare them for the challenges of contemporary South African society. Another important aspect of the hub is the development of networks with institutions involved in psychological work on the rest of the continent to enable the exchange of ideas that could contribute to alternative teaching, learning, and research practices. In what follows, we outline a proposed decolonial feminist agenda for the hub. The research areas outlined are not new research areas for psychology per se. However, it is in the foregrounding and institutionalizing of these perspectives that we envisage that psychology can contribute to innovations that advance social justice and see transformative changes in our society. Disciplinary knowledges reflect Euro-American knowledge systems, silencing their positional ITY in location, and distributing knowledge in globalizing ways to apply to all of the world. It is no accident that protests around decolonization have occurred in universities as primary spaces of knowledge production across the globe, e.g., #Rhodes Must Fall 1 in South Africa and at Oxford University, #Royal Must Fall 2 at Harvard University. We understand a decolonial agenda for psychology as one that highlights the connections between psychological knowledge production and the reproduction of oppressive power in its various forms. Mignolo, 2003, page 99, refers to universities as institutions that reproduce coloniality at a global scale under neoliberal values and principles of education. Hence, a decolonial psychology is a commitment to the political transformation of the discipline and its institutional place, challenging not only what counts as psychology, its epistemic foundations, but also how it is practiced, where it is located, and who has access to it. At the same time, some of the social movements around decolonization have faced challenges and contestation around their marginalization of intersectional feminist concerns and politics. Omar, 2016. These challenges of social movements illustrate the importance of feminist work to the decolonization project, work that must foreground gender and other intersectionalities. Both decolonial and intersectional feminist perspectives recognize the important ways in which identities and experiences like race, class, and gender are intertwined, in opposition to the ways in which Hesse and Bunzeyer 305. Psychological knowledge has traditionally packaged these identities as separate. We advocate for a space that opens up conversations about and research on the intersections as they manifest. Indeed, the student movements across South African universities in recent years have been calling for free decolonial education. A decolonial feminist psychological lens into social movements, leadership, and activism can contribute to new understandings of political behavior and extend the existing social identity critique of conservative/traditional psychological research. Haslam and Riker, 2016, Ipsos, 2013. Such work would also move away from individualistic and masculinist interpretations towards an investigation into contemporary forms of leadership, the role of collective action, activism within bureaucracies, and their impact on sustainable change. As critical feminist psychologists, we are particularly interested in how a Pan-African feminist lens, Abbas and Mama, 2014, Davies, 2014, can contribute to theorizing and activism for social justice. Following #Rhodes Must Fall, many questions have been raised about learning spaces and the symbolisms and artifacts displayed around university campuses and their impact on people's sense of belonging and well-being and what is valued in a particular environment. People's identities are shaped by the historically determined places and spaces they live in or frequent on a regular basis. Durkheim, 2005, for example, conflicting identities in national discourses or assumptions about normative bodies occupying particular spaces. Bunzeyer et al., Press, Kirkwood, McKinley, and McVitie, 2013. We propose that a decolonial feminist project for psychology centers questions of institutional racism, embodiment and space, identity-related impact of colonization and dispossession. These calls have to do with the psychological, symbolic, and material impact of segregation and exclusion from access to resources and centers of power. Despite frequent academic and popular references to traumatic histories implicating colonization, slavery, and apartheid, the impact of these histories on contemporary ways of being and relating have not been sufficiently engaged with. Although psychology is well placed to consider what the afterlives of colonization, slavery, and apartheid might mean for contemporary lives, identities, and experiences, these questions have not been attended to and do not engage sufficiently with African, gendered, and/or localized conceptions of trauma and responses to trauma. Palmery, 2005, Segalo, 2015. This includes the absence of popular memories on slavery and the impact of slavery and its associated dehumanizations through violence, sexual violence in particular. The issue of transgenerational trauma is central to thinking through the high levels of violence in South Africa and the impact of the epistemic violences enacted on generations of people. Psychological work must interrogate what the implications of these traumatic histories mean for understanding contemporary identities and conditions, especially for understanding the persistence of gendered and other forms of violence. As Phillips, Adams, and Salter, 2015, suggest, we also need to reframe our thinking about what it means to cope with trauma and racism in a context in which psychological research has targeted the mindset and efficacy of beliefs of people from oppressed groups as a prescription for health and well-being in situations of oppression, page 366. We need to widen our angle in order to address the case tie-in. How do people in conditions of oppression navigate the pathogenic environments that they are forced to inhabit, page 366. South Africa is recognized and celebrated globally for its reconciliatory approach to endemic racism through the establishment of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in 1995. Despite the many insights gained from this process, there have been many frustrations 20 years on, resulting from the slow pace of change and rising inequalities. Questions and processes for reconciliation are closely tied to psychological recovery, as treaties and negotiations may not address the deep-seated psychological violence of intractable conflicts. Bartel, 2001, Staub, 2006. This can be seen through the Rwandan experience following the 1994 genocide. Staub, 2006. Much can also be learned from connecting these experiences to the calls for reparations in the aftermath of 306 South African Journal of Psychology 48, 3. Slavery. Seeking reparations has been a key project for decolonization across the continent and the diaspora. Black liberation movements and Pan-African movements, in particular in the Caribbean, have called for repair, restitution, and recompense as a moral obligation. 3. As psychologists, we must interrogate whether reconciliation and/or reparations address the psychological wounds of slavery and apartheid. While we suggest that psychologists address a range of research priorities emerging from a feminist, decolonial, psychological agenda, we are also calling for a thinking through of our research practices and what this means for producing contextually relevant knowledges. Because of the history of the knowledge production machinery in a discipline like psychology, it is important to center ways of working that engage seriously with the ethics, politics, and practices of the research endeavor, to ask how this advances a decolonial, feminist agenda. In recognition that academic discourse produced by disciplines like psychology have silenced and pathologized the experiences of marginalized groups, it is important that our practices center discussions on power, politics, representation, and critical reflexivity in order to carefully think through the effects of the research and the ways in which it positions individuals and communities. Conclusion. In this article, we reflect on the historical legacies of the discipline of psychology as they intertwine with the afterlives of colonization and apartheid. We propose that psychology curricula and research agendas in Africa should embrace a decolonial feminist stance. We argue that such an agenda must engage with both epistemic and institutional concerns centering the dismantling of the power relations of coloniality in the aftermath of apartheid and colonization and the instituting of new principles, pleas, and philosophies to guide the psychological project. Much of this work will revolve around legacies of violence manifested and resisted through scholarship on intersectional identities and oppressions, social movements and activism, institutional cultures, transgenerational and historical trauma, reparations and reconciliation, and other matters of social and political significance in contemporary African contexts. Acknowledgements. We gratefully acknowledge funding for this project from the University of Cape Town. Funding. The authors received no financial support for the research, authorship, and/or publication of this article. Notes. 1. A collective movement of students and staff members mobilizing for direct action against the reality of institutional racism at the University of Cape Town. See https://www.facebook.com/pg/rhodes-must-fall/https://ref=page_internal2. See https://www.theguardian.com/education/APR//racism Harvard Law School. psychological practice with introduction. 1A component of identity that includes a person's sexual and emotional attraction to sexual minority persons are a diverse population inclusive of lesbian, gay, bi+, e.g., bisexual, pansexual, queer, fluid, and asexual sexual orientations. 1. The guidelines for psychological practice with sexual minority persons provide psychologists with 1. A frame of reference for affirmative psychological practice, e.g., intervention, testing, assessment, diagnosis, education, research, etc., with sexual minority clients across the lifespan, and 2. Knowledge and reference scholarship in the areas of affirmative intervention, assessment, identity, relationships, diversity, education, training, advocacy, and research. These guidelines also recognize that some sexual minority persons possess diverse gender identities and expressions, e.g., transgender, gender non-binary, or gender fluid. These practice guidelines are a third iteration, built upon the guidelines for psychotherapy. With lesbian, gay, and bisexual clients, American Psychological Association's APA Division 44/Committee on Sexual Orientation and Gender Diversity Joint Task Force on Guidelines for Psychotherapy with Lesbian, Gay, and Bisexual Clients, 2000, and the Revised Guidelines for Psychological Practice with Lesbian, Gay, and Bisexual Clients, APA's Division 44/Committee on Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, and Transgender Concerns Guidelines Revision Task Force, 2012. These practice guidelines were created by the process outlined by the Criteria for Practice Guideline Development and Evaluation, APA, 2002, and consistent with the APA's 2017 Ethical Principles of Psychologists and Code of Conduct, including 2010 and 2016 amendments. For APA Guidelines for Psychological Practice with Sexual Minority Persons. Need. The guidelines for psychological practice with sexual minority persons assist psychologists in their work with sexual minority persons. A contemporary revision of the guidelines is warranted at this time given the notable advances in psychological science and affirmative psychological practice, see Appendix A, with sexual minority persons. In the years since the revised version of the guidelines for psychological practice with lesbian, gay, and bisexual clients, 2012, was released, there has been significant growth in rigorous psychological research published on sexual minority persons, as well as important legal and policy changes in the United States and elsewhere. Long-standing, important topics have evolved, and scholars have expanded into new areas of relevance for psychologists working with sexual minority persons. Previous guidelines on psychological practice with lesbian, gay, and bisexual clients have been used nationally and internationally in practice, training, and to inform public policy. APA's Office on Sexual Orientation and Gender Diversity have translated previous versions of guidelines into Arabic, Chinese, Czech, Hungarian, and Spanish, which reflects the global relevance and importance of these guidelines to international communities. Task Force Process and Language. The Revisions Task Force was formed in October 2018 and concluded its work on these guidelines on August 31st, 2020. The task force met during that period, both in person and virtually, and task force members met exclusively using virtual conferencing software during the COVID-19 global pandemic of 2020. Task force members agreed that scholarship and scientific research produced over the past 10 years were to be prioritized to inform these practice guidelines. Sources included meta-analyses and systematic reviews, quantitative, qualitative, and mixed method studies published in peer-reviewed journals, and select books and book chapters. Task force members intentionally highlighted available scholarship from show hours of color, as well as sexual and gender minority scholars. Reviewers with scientific and clinical expertise on sexual minority populations were solicited to provide feedback on these guidelines throughout the writing and revision process. Task force members had multiple conversations about language. Task force members were cognizant that terminology related to sexual minority populations have changed over time and across ecological contexts, and will continue to evolve beyond the publication of these guidelines. Terminology used in these guidelines is consistent with current trends in science, scholarship, and psychological practice. For instance, task force members decided to use the term sexual minority rather than lesbian, gay, and bisexual. We believe the term sexual minority is consistent with the sexual minority stress theory, Meyer, 1995, 2003, scaffolding these guidelines. See below for further discussion on these conceptual foundations. The task force recognizes, however, that sexual minority is a term that some find problematic, as it can homogenize a widely diverse group of people and center individual experiences against the dominant hegemony of heterosexuality. Psychologists understand that. Although some clients may use this terminology, others may refer to sexual orientations that are not mentioned in these guidelines. In some instances, clients may not wish to use any existing term or label. Psychologists do not force terms or labels on any client and educate themselves on evolving linguistic trends. APA 2017b. Conceptual foundations. The current practice guidelines are conceptually rooted in the theoretical frameworks of sexual minority stress theory, Meyer, 1995, 2003, 2015, intersectionality, Crenshaw, 1989, and principles of affirmative psychology, see Moradi and Budge, 2018 for review. According to the sexual minority stress model, sexual minority persons experience both general stressors and unique stressors as a result of encountering societal and interpersonal prejudice and stigma, Meyer, 2003. In turn, these stressors can lead to poor health and identity-based disparities, Meyer, 2003, 2015. Sexual minority persons encounter stress along a continuum of distal minority stressors and proximal minority stressors throughout their lifespan. Distal minority stressors, which are experiential encounters distant to the sexual minority person, include interpersonal discrimination, victimization, hate crimes, microaggressions, and other daily hassles. Meyer, 2003. Proximal minority stressors, stressors that are internalized via cognitive and effectual processes of a sexual minority person, include internalized heterosexism, internalized negativity, anticipation of stress and stigma, including resulting anxiety and worry, and identity concealment. Meyer, 2015. Minority stressors occur across the lifespan and intersect with other forms of internalized and enacted stigma, i.e., racism, sexism, classism, discrimination, objectification, ableism, ageism, English et al., 2018, Hatzenbuller, 2009, Veles et al., 2017. Minority stressors also are associated with numerous psychological and physical health risks and occur across a variety of environmental contexts, e.g., school, home, work, and community. Adaptive coping strategies and mechanisms, social supports, and resilience buffer against the effects of sexual minority stress, helping to reduce or prevent poor health outcomes. Kwan, 2013, Meyer, 2015. Although sexual minority persons experience oppression from heterosexism, the task force acknowledges the impact of additional systems of oppression that influence the lives of many sexual minority persons, e.g., institutional racism, systemic sexism, colonialism. Since social identities are not mutually exclusive, people embody multiple positions of oppression and privilege, whereby stress produces vulnerabilities that are differentially distributed across multiple axes of difference. Riggs and Treharn, 2017, page 603. Thus, these practice guidelines utilize the framework of intersectionality, a term originally coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, 1989, to describe the discrimination experienced by Black women that is rooted in both racism and sexism. Although Crenshaw did not specifically focus on sexual minority persons in her analyses, sexual minority women of color who preceded her laid important groundwork that has influenced current understandings of intersectionality. Combahee River Collective, 1977, Moraga and Anzaldúa, 1981. 4. Example, the Combahee River Collective Statement, 1977, posited the most general statement of our politics at the present time would. APA Guidelines for Psychological Practice with Sexual Minority Persons 5. B. That we are actively committed to struggling against racial, sexual, heterosexual, and class oppression, and C as our particular task the development of integrated analysis and practice based upon the fact that the major systems of oppression are interlocking. Page 1. Thus, intersectionality recognizes that individual and collective experiences are shaped by multiple interlocking systems of oppression including, but not limited to, racism, sexism, heterosexism, and classism. Crenshaw, 1989, Moradi and Kuzenka, 2017, Nash, 2019, Rosenthal, 2016. Social categories, e.g., race, gender, sexual identity, age, disability status, religion and spirituality, social class, are multiple, interdependent and mutually constitutive. Bolle, 2013, Collins, 1991. As such, sexual minority persons experience various privileges and oppressions based on how their other social identities are valued or denigrated by society. Much of the psychological research on sexual minority persons reflects the experiences of those with more privy whereas those who experience multiple forms of oppression are often overlooked. These guidelines consider sexual minority status, as well as other social identities that sexual minority persons embody. We further recommend that psychologists utilize other APA guidelines that address working with diverse populations, such as the Multicultural Guidelines, an ecological approach to context, identity, and intersectionality, APA 2017b, and race and ethnicity guidelines in psychology, promoting responsiveness and equity, APA 2019b. These revised guidelines are further rooted in scholarship encouraging psychologists to affirm sexual minority persons in the practice of psychology. Affirmative principles and practices include, but are not limited to, approaching and including sexual minority identities as a normal component of human sexuality, not pathologizing behavior and affection expressed between sexual minority persons, acquiring and utilizing accurate knowledge of sexual minority persons to effectively practice psychology, addressing and counteracting anti-sexual minority attitudes, stigma, and sexual minority stress, and providing encouragement, support, and promote ing resilience and pride. Muradi and Budge, 2018. Pachenkis, 2018. Pepping et al., 2018. Consistent with affirmative practices, psychologists also engage in critical self-reflection as a means of increasing their awareness of any implicit and explicit attitudes, beliefs, values, and assumptions they may have when engaged in psychological practice with culturally diverse individuals. APA, 2015A, 2017B, 2019B. Similarly, psychologists are encouraged to engage in critical self-reflective practices when working with sexual minority persons. Psychologists should reflect on their various social positions, examine how their identities are embedded within various systems of privilege and oppression, and critique and modify how these various stances impact their work with sexual minority persons. Purpose, scope, and organization. Sexual minority identities exist and persist throughout the lifespan. In the 2015 U.S. Youth Risk Behavior Surveillance Study, authors estimated that there are approximately 1.29 million youth under the age of 18 who identify as a sexual minority. Zaz et al., 2016. The Williams Institute, 2019, estimated that there are approximately 10.34 million adults, 18 years of age and older, living in the United States who identify as a sexual minority, with approximately 42% of them also identifying as people of color. Using a representative SAM-PLE of sexual minority adults living in the United States, Rothblum et al., 2019, estimated that 1.66% of respondents identify as asexual. Asexual persons are underrepresented in the psychological literature, and more research is needed to provide them with appropriate psychological services. Further, it has been estimated that there are over 2.4 million sexual minority older adults over age 50 in the United States, with the expectation that this number will double to over 5 million by the year 2030. Fredrickson Goldson et al., 2014. The present document provides guidelines that enhance psychological practice with sexual minority persons. These guidelines provide general recommendations for psychologists and psychologists in training who seek to increase their awareness, knowledge, and skills in psychological practice with sexual minority persons. The beneficiaries of these guidelines are all consumers of psychological practice, including clients, students, supervisors, research participants, consultees, and other health and mental health professionals. Although the guidelines and supporting show RSIP place substantial emphasis on counseling and psychotherapy practice, they are applicable to psychologists across areas of practice, e.g., individual, couples and family work, group work, psychoeducational programming, consultation, testing and assessment, diagnosis, prevention, clinical supervision, teaching, career counseling, and observational and intervention research across multiple related helping professions, e.g., nursing, social work, counseling, psychiatry, and across settings, e.g., university counseling centers, hospitals, clinics, veterans hospitals, medical centers, rehabilitation facilities, schools, military, community mental health facilities, correction settings, and private practice. Rather than offering a comprehensive review of content relevant to all areas of practice, this document provides examples of empirical and conceptual literature that support the need for practice guidelines with sexual minority persons. We encourage institutions, agencies, departments, and individuals to discuss ways in which these guidelines may be applied to their own settings and relevant activities. Professional practice guidelines are statements that suggest specific professional behaviors, endeavors, or conduct for psychologists, APA, 2015b. Guidelines differ from standards in that standards are mandatory and may be accompanied by an enforcement mechanism. Thus, guidelines are aspirational in intent, and they are intended to facilitate the continued systematic development of the profession to help assure a high level of professional practice by psychologists, APA, 2015b. Guidelines may be superseded by federal or state laws, and APA, 2015b, distinguishes between clinic, Cal practice guidelines and professional practice guidelines, noting that the former provides specific recommendations about clinical interventions, whereas the latter are designed to guide psychologists in practice with regards to particular roles, populations, or settings and provide them with the current scholarly literature representing and reflect consensus within the field, page 823. Additionally, as noted by APA, 2015b, guidelines may not be applicable to every professional and clinical situation, page 824. Thus, These guidelines are not definitive and are designed to respect the decision-making judgment of individual professional psychologists. 6 APA Guidelines for Psychological Practice with Sexual Minority Persons. Consistent with the recommendations and procedures outlined by APA 2015b, these guidelines will need to be periodically reviewed and updated every 10 years, from the year of acceptance by the APA Council of Representatives. Updating these practice guidelines will account for advances in research and changes in practice, as well as changes in contemporary social forces and contexts that influence the professional practice of psychology. Hence, readers are advised to check the status of these guidelines to ensure that they are still in effect and have not been superseded by subsequent revisions. This document contains 16 guidelines for psychological practice with sexual minority persons and groups, along with appendices defining key terms and providing additional resources to psychologists. Each practice guideline includes a rationale section, which reviews relevant scholarship supporting the need for the guideline, and an application section, which describes how the particular guideline may be applied in psychological practice. These practice guidelines are organized into 5 topical sections: A. Foundational knowledge and awareness; B. Impact of stigma, discrimination, and sexual minority stress; C. Relationships and family; D. Education and vocational issues; and E. Professional education, training, and research. Acknowledgements. The guidelines revision process was funded by Division 44, the APA Office of Sexual Orientation and Gender Diversity, and a generous donation from the H. Van Ameringen Foundation. The APA Task Force on the revision of the guidelines would like to acknowledge the following contributors and reviewers to the content of these guidelines: Carla Onholt, Kimberly F. Balsam, Lee Beckstead, Melanie E. Brewster, Colton Brown, Theo Burns, Heather Calhoun, Allison Cerezo, Cliff Chin, David L. Chiesa, Jamian S. Coleman, Courtney Crisp, Christopher Davis, Laura M. Dickey, Melissa Duncan, Jan Estrelado, Rachel Farr, Ryan Flynn, Lisa Flores, M. Pazgalupo, Abby E. Goldberg, Julie M. Green, Patrick R. Fazenka, Doug Haldeman, Chris Hancock, Kara Herbitter, Gary Howell, Tanya Israel, Ethan Mearsh, James McElligott, Linda Mona, Jen Moran, Amy L. Morse, Amanda Pollitt, Paul Poteet, Amy Prescott, Nick Ryder, Ellen. Guidelines for Psychological Practice. Sexual Minority. 8 APA Guidelines for the Guidelines. Foundational knowledge and awareness. Guideline 1. Psychologists understand that people have diverse sexual orientations that intersect with other identities and contexts. Guideline 2. Psychologists distinguish issues of sexual orientation from those of gender identity and expression when working with sexual minority persons. Guideline 3. Psychologists strive to affirm bi+ identities and examine their monosexist biases. Guideline 4. Psychologists understand that sexual minority orientations are not mental illnesses, and that efforts to change sexual orientations cause harm. Impact of stigma, discrimination, and sexual minority stress. Guideline 5. Psychologists recognize the influence of institutional discrimination that exists for sexual minority persons, and the need to promote social change. Guideline 6. Psychologists understand the influence that distal minority stressors have on sexual minority persons, and the need to promote social change. Guideline 7. Psychologists recognize the influence that proximal minority stressors have on the mental, physical, and psychosocial health of sexual minority persons. Guideline 8. Psychologists recognize the positive aspects of being a sexual minority person and the individual and collective ways that sexual minority persons display resilience and resistance to stigma and oppression. Relationships and family. Guideline 9. Psychologists strive to be knowledgeable about and respect diverse relationships among sexual minority persons. Guideline 10. Psychologists recognize the importance and complexity of sexual health in the lives of sexual minority persons. Guideline 11. Psychologists strive to understand sexual minority persons' relationships with their families of origin, as well as their families of choice. Guideline 12. Psychologists strive to understand the experiences, challenges, and strengths faced by sexual minority parents and their children. Education and vocational issues. Guideline 13. Psychologists strive to understand the educational and school system experiences that impact sexual minority students in K-12 and college/university settings. Guideline 14. Psychologists strive to understand career development and workplace issues for sexual minority persons. Professional education, training, and research. Guideline 15. Psychologists strive to educate themselves and others on psychological issues relevant to sexual minority persons, and to utilize that knowledge to improve training programs and educational systems. Guideline 16. Psychologists strive to take an affirming stance towards sexual minority persons and communities in all aspects of planning, conduct, dissemination, and application of research to reduce health disparities and promote psychological health and well-being. APA Guidelines for Psychological Practice with Sexual Minority Persons 9. Foundational Knowledge and Awareness. Guideline 1. Psychologists understand that people have diverse sexual orientations that intersect with other identities and contexts. Rationale. Sexual minority identity labels are culturally specific, widely varying, and ever-evolving. Some commonly used terms are lesbian, gay, bi+, pronounced bi+, queer, and asexual, although this is not an exhaustive list. Additional within-group differences can be found. For example, within the bi+ community, some may identify as bisexual, fluid, pansexual, or panromantic. There are also important differences between sexual minority groups. For instance, efforts to achieve marriage equality seem to have improved the standing of lesbians and gay men, but have been criticized for underrepresenting the concerns of bi+ individuals. Marcus, 2018. The invisibility experienced by bi+ individuals, including within communities working on behalf of sexual minority persons, is called bisexual erasure. Yoshino, 2000. Important cultural differences exist among sexual minority persons. For example, most research on sexual minority persons is conducted with Western samples, and our understanding of sexual orientation is skewed to a Western perspective. Nakamura and Logi, 2020. There is no universal experience shared by sexual minority persons around the globe. Patil, 2013. Pori, 2016, including when working in Western countries with sexual minority immigrants or binational couples. Additional cultural differences influence how sexual identity is expressed and enacted. Fassinger and Arsenault, 2007. Important differences exist between racial and ethnic groups of sexual minorities. McConnell et al., 2018, and collective knowledge about the experiences of individuals who identify as sexual minority people of color is valuable. People of color who are members of sexual minority groups may experience racism in sexual minority communities as well as heterosexism in racial and ethnic communities. Velez et al., 2017. Thus, they may feel excluded from or be mistreated by multiple communities. For example, when sexual minority men utilize online dating services, many user profiles specify no Asians. Nakamura et al., 2013. Furthermore, sexual minority people of color may experience tension between different aspects of their identities or conflicted allegiances. Sarno et al., 2015. People of color who encounter both racial and sexual minority stressors are at increased risk of developing mental health issues, such as depression or anxiety. Sutter and Perrin, 2016. Expressions and enactments of sexual identity may depend on other circumstances as well, such as whether sexual minority individuals are refugees or immigrants, are living in poverty or are homeless, are affiliated with a religion or not, are teenagers or older adults, have disabilities of any kind, e.g., physical, developmental, sensory, psychiatric, chronic illness, or live in rural or urban areas. For example, research has documented greater barriers to healthcare access and more negative interactions with healthcare providers from sexual minority persons who live in rural areas compared to those who live in urban areas, e.g., Barefoot et al., 2015, see review in Rosenkrantz et al., 2017. Rather than considering identities as separate, it is important to consider multi-PLE identities together, e.g., sexual orientation, gender, race, and ethnicity, because all are central to mental health. Intersectional ITY theory provides a useful framework for this understanding. Bambara, 1970, Beale, 1969, Crenshaw, 1989. Lesbians of color have been described as triple minorities for over 20 years. Green, 1996. Yet, the impact of interlocking systems of offers shown may be different for different groups, such as the impact of colonialism on Indic, Enos, Aboriginal, and Native peoples, for whom the terms Two-Spirit and Bi+ may or may not overlap. Robinson, 2017. Two or more axes of oppression may combine to create unique structural barriers. Collins and Bilge, 2016, and these inequities can vary across different contexts or eras. Moradi and Kuzenka, 2017. Gender serves as another example when applying intersectionality with sexual minority persons. Many transgender individuals living in the United States describe themselves as queer, pansexual, bisexual, gay, lesbian, or same-gender law ing. James et al., 2016. Furthermore, bi+ individuals who identify as transgender are at greater risk of poor physical health outcomes than those who identify as cisgender. Katzweiss et al., 2017. In addition, North American bi+ people of color who identify as either female or gender diverse have reported that they never feel like they belong in any of their communities, experience passing as heterosexual or white is a stressor rather than an advantage, and cannot find resources relevant to their concerns. Gabriel, 2019. Sexual minority persons often demonstrate resilience when faced with heterosexism, racism, and sexism. Cerezo et al., 2019, Watson et al., 2018, but resilience may look different in various cultures. For instance, young ladies, gay and bisexual men demonstrate resilience in the face of family microaggressions by developing their own self-acceptance and understanding of what it means to be a ladies, gay or bisexual man, when no support for this endeavor was available in either their cultural or LGBTQ+ communities. By adapting to social settings in which they were aware of microagger science, but did not internalize or become consumed by them, and through self-advocacy, Lee et al., 2017. Minority statuses can create unique opportunities for community building, consciousness raising, political resistance, and collective action that reduces symptoms of discrimination stress, de Blair et al., 2014. For instance, multi-racial bi-plus people have reported that they can develop strong connections within small communities of similar others, that their identities make them feel strong, and 10 APA guidelines for psychological practice with sexual minority persons. Unique, and that they enjoy having multiple perspectives and experiences, Gallupo et al., 2019. Application. When applying intersectionality theory to sexual minority individuals, psychologists consider the influences of multiple, interlocking systems of oppressions related to race, gender, sexual orientation, disability status, socioeconomic status, age, and religion, among others. Although psychologists aspire to be inclusive of all sexual minority persons and knowledgeable about their diverse experiences and perspectives, this is a difficult, ongoing task. Nonetheless, psychologists attempt to refrain from assuming that the experiences of bi-plus women are the same as those of lesbian women, for example, or that white, Western models apply to sexual minority persons living in other parts of the world. In some cases, other cultural approaches to healing may offer opportunity for symptom relief, such as Asian American sexual minorities suffering from chronic, cumulative stress who benefit from Qigong, acupuncture, and meditation, Ching et al., 2018. Culturally, specific psychotherapy approaches rise to reduce racial minority stress, Comas Diaz et al., 2019, along with therapeutic models that address multiple identities and minority stressors among sexual minority persons are recommended, Balsam et al., 2017, Choi and Israel, 2016, Dominguez, 2017, Ferguson, 2016. Psychologists strive to concurrently address racism, heterosexism, sexism, ageism, ableism, and other structural oppressions. Recommendations include recognizing economic, environmental, and socio-political forces that impact the mental health of diverse sexual minority individuals who may face additional barriers, develop ING and interdisciplinary understanding of social determinants of health, health disparities, and epigenetics, formulating structural conceptualizations of how inequities and barriers to inclusion are produced and impact individuals and groups, imagining and implementing structural interventions to address the impact that current financial, legislative, and cultural decisions have had on health infrastructures, and recognizing with humility the limitations of the structural competencies listed above as economies and other national or cultural issues shift over time, Metzel and Hansen, 2014. Psychologists may find it beneficial to consult the multicultural guidelines, an ecological approach to context, identity, and intersectionality, APA 2017b, and race and ethnicity guidelines in psychology, promoting responsiveness and equity, APA 2019b, for further guidance. Psychologists consider interventions that promote resistance, recognize that people can experience both privilege and oppression simultaneously, and foster the exploration of individual experiences with oppression and privilege to inform their interventions, Murati and Brzenka, 2017, Rosenthal, 2016. Psychologists aspire to integrate social justice into training curricula and to foster deeper understandings of privilege. Finally, identifying the groups of sexual minority people who may have been neglected within the specific settings in which psychologists' work can help inform systemic interventions and advocacy efforts. For example, noting settings where lesbian and gay male clients seek services but not bi-plus clients, where white sexual minority clients seek services but not sexual minority people of color, or where barriers to persons with disabilities being served are not addressed. Guideline 2 psychologists distinguish issues of sexual orientation from those of gender identity and expression when working with sexual minority persons. Rationale. Sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression are distinct, but interrelated characteristics, APA 2015a. Gender identity is defined as a person's felt, inherent sense of one's own gender, APA 2015a. Gender expression refers to the external, physical appearance of a person's gender identity, e.g., clothing, makeup, hairstyle, as well as behaviors that express aspects of one's gender, APA 2015a. Gender expression may or may not be consistent with a person's gender identity. This is referred to as gender conformity or nonconformity, respectively. Although sexual orientation may involve attraction to various aspects of gender, an individual's gender identity and expression do not imply any specific sexual orientation. That is, sexual minority persons may be cisgender, transgender, non-binary, or identify with other diverse genders. Chang et al., 2017. Conflating sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression, or to assume a person's sexual orientation based on their gender identity or expression, is a common error that psychologists aspire to refrain from making. Sexual minority youth and adults may present with diverse styles of gender expression, which may or may not be traditionally gender conforming. Because it continues to be highly stigmatized, gender nonconformity can result in prejudice and discrimination. Gender nonconformity has been negatively associated with well-being, regardless of one's identified sexual orientation. Tagayan, Gordon et al., 2017, Rieger and Savon-Williams, 2012. Research with youth indicates that gender nonconformity, regardless of sexual orientation, evokes at least as much antipathy among high school students as does a sexual minority orientation alone, and has been associated with increased risk of abuse and post-traumatic stress disorder, e.g., Horn, 2007, Roberts et al., 2012. Among adolescent and young adult men, regardless of sexual orientation, gender nonconformity has also been identified as an important risk indicator for intimate partner violence, Adia et al., 2018. Psychologists may work with sexual minority persons who voice their concerns about how gender expression, conforming or nonconforming, is related to their sexual orientation and the perceptions of others, e.g., for safety reasons. Transgender individuals and gender non-binary persons may identify with any sexual orientation, and psychologists should not assume them to be a sexual minority. Likewise, some individuals, regardless of gender, may find that labels or categories are inadequate to describe their sexuality, APA 2015a, Chang et al., 2017. Transgender and gender non-binary sexual minority persons may be more likely to identify as bi+, pansexual, or queer, James et al., 2016, Cooper et al., 2012. In some instances, sexual orientation may become APA Guidelines for Psychological Practice with Sexual Minority Persons 11. More fluid in the context of gender-affirm ing medical interventions, such as hormone therapy, for transgender persons, Dickey et al., 2012, Gallupo et al., 2014, Gallupo et al., 2016, Yash et al., 2019. A causal link has not been established between gender-affirming medical interventions and shifting sexual attractions, however, and it is unclear whether such reported changes in sexuality are related to physiological changes with gender transition, increased self-confidence and well-being, decreased dysphoria, or other interrelated factors. Fox-Tree MC Graf et al., 2018. Sexual fluidity, of course, has been described in cisgender individuals as well, e.g., Diamond, 2008, Diamond et al., 2017. Application. Psychologists are in a position to assist individuals of all gender identities and X-ray science with exploring their sexual orientations. Psychologists are encouraged to validate, normalize, and assist others in understand the complex interactions between sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression, keeping cultural differences in mind. Distinction between these concepts is not acknowledged universally, with some ethnocultural and indigenous communities viewing sex, gender, sexual orientation, and gender expression as much more fluid and